You and activist Jamie Klinger. So a very good morning to both of you. Lovely to see you both. We're kicking off with the Eye because they have put the threat to Labour from reform on their front page. The headline, Starmer faces growing threat from reform over migration. And this is according to a poll, they say.
Yes, so this is an incredible, one of those big MRP polls from the political consultancy Stonehaven, which predicts 120 seats to reform next election, which is, you know, obviously a very kind of maximalist result for reform. More in Common, another polling group, puts it at more like 67 seats. But even that, you know, coming from where we were this time last election of just 5 seats, is an incredible, would be an incredible progress and achievement for reform. And it's all based on migration, it seems, because, you know, the small boats crossings in the last year have risen 24% compared to the year before, and doesn't really look like Labour has much of a plan to deal with it. Now, of course, it used to be kind of Conservatives that had problems with this, but it just shows that Labour's victory is actually quite shallow when it comes to why it won. It was more because people didn't want the Conservatives rather than because they actively wanted Labour.
Well, yes, and certainly that was said at the time, wasn't it, that they did won an extraordinary number of seats, but the margins were quite narrow in each of them. And in fact, Reform did come second in a number of Labour seats. I mean, a lot of the focus was on the Tories, but in fact, they were snapping at the heels of Labour even in the last election.
And if we get that big of a rise of Reform, they're talking about those super voters who already moved from Conservative. If they move further right, then the whole shift will go. And so it's just a matter of how do they respond to this and how do they respond to it in a way that's not just knee-jerk, just for headlines, rather than actually getting the faith of people.
That is the challenge for Labour as the incumbent government, that the main challenge is with them, presumably. But there are challenges for the Tories as well and how they handle this, because some will say that it's people who were more naturally in the Conservative camp who are more likely to be drawn to
Absolutely,
Reform.
and just yesterday another Conservative left the Conservative Party to go join Reform, and we see that recently that Reform Party now has more members than the Conservative Party. So you're absolutely right. The traditional constituency that goes to Conservatives are now going to Reform. Kemi Badenoch came in being voted on a platform of saying, I want to be setting a direction for policy. I don't want to be telling you the specific direction policies yet, but I want to set a tone, a direction. But she is running out of time to be vague, really, because Nigel Farage is just taking up so much airtime. And with Elon Musk and Donald Trump coming in across the pond, you know, they are just sucking out all of the airtime from anyone else.
And adding all the money.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about Elon Musk and really funneling so much money, we've already seen this happen. We need to be very aware of it and need to make decisions on whether or not we want people that are not voting and people who are not integral to the process to be giving that kind of money to Reform.
And that's why an extra dimension is added when Elon Musk criticises the UK, and that takes us to the front of the Daily Mail, doesn't it? Because Elon Musk has fired a number of salvos at Keir Starmer's government already, but the latest issue that he has, I think this is the wrong paper, it's actually the front page that we're looking at. That's an inside page that we might come to a little bit later on. The front page, just to tell you, while we'll try and find it, is Starmer guilty as anyone over grooming gang. So this is an issue that Elon Musk is now accusing Keir Starmer of having failed on in the past. This has been picked up by some of the papers and also some of the other political parties as well.
Yeah, and some of the participants in the scandal are saying that they're being exploited by Elon Musk, and that's not what happened. And so when you've got somebody that's outside of the scope of it and hasn't necessarily seen the reporting for the last 10 years, and then is coming in and writing incendiary tweets and getting it piled on, especially for some of these victims, it's quite upsetting. One of the women yesterday did a long thread about how she was part of it. She knows where the corruption was. She knows what police did. She knows what social workers didn't do. And that by minimizing it and by leaping on her story as one of the victims, it's really unfair to her and her experiences to not really take any information from the victims.
Well, yes, and this is this article is focusing on the former detective Maggie Oliver, who has also given her view on this case and said that Keir Starmer is as guilty as anyone over the failures. I think she's also talked about lots of political parties and bodies having failed these young girls in the past. But this has got some traction now, hasn't it? I mean, there's an awful lot of talk about it on social media, but the Tories have said that they want to see some kind of inquiry now.
Absolutely. Kemi Badenoch has jumped on it and asked for a national inquiry into these historic sexual abuses. And it does seem like the only reason reason it's come back up again is because Elon Musk tweeted about it. Not that these are not important issues or that they have been given justice for any of the victims, but actually, you know, Professor Alexis Jay, who did an inquiry on this from 2014 to 2022, says that none of her recommendations were implemented by the Conservative government.
And this
Labour is not
of...
talking about implementing that now. So the question isn't more inquiries, I think.
Right.
It's actually just to react to what has been decided so far.
And that's where, like Baroness Casey, Angelini inquiries, they do these, and there's millions and millions of dollars to spend. And how many incredibly brilliant women can we have go in, spend a year and millions to come up with their advising, and like Baroness Casey's was 360 pages for the Casey review, and they haven't been implemented. So we can do all the reviews in the world, but unless we're actually taking the findings and the governments are moving forward on them and having them accountable to those findings and answering to a year later, 6 months later, 4 years later, we're just stuck in the same rut where everyone calls for an inquiry, it gets off the front pages, the inquiry happens, and nothing improves.
OK, yeah, so that's where you think the focus should be. OK, let's move on to a story that's on the front of the Daily Telegraph this morning. It's not their main story, but it's the second story, net zero fines to kill off cheap car deals.
Yes, I find this an incredible and very interesting policy for the government to be making. We know about the net zero policy. We know about this move towards electric cars. The government has a mandate to say that at least 28% of cars sold by British car makers this year has to be electric. And anyone who doesn't meet that target is actually being punished per car by the figure of about £15,000 for every petrol car that they sell that's not within that target. And so what's actually happening is, in this kind of move towards net zero, British car makers are being punished at a time when Chinese competition, for example, is coming from across the continent. And for the sake of kind of a faster green transition. And of course, the green transition is very important, but we have car makers here saying that actually this is too much on a punitive side. You should be talking more about carrots to produce more electric cars rather than punishing us for basically consumers not moving fast enough in changing their demand.
Do you think that's right? I mean, do you think that obviously the intention is to get people to drive electric cars rather than petrol cars, and they're trying to make it kind of economically more viable, they would say. But at the same time, if cars are still pretty expensive, electric cars are expensive, and people are worried about there being enough
fuel
charging
crisis.
points.
Like, we're in heating crisis, we're in fuel crisis, the cost of living has gone up so much that people aren't getting cars. And so, like, I looked at Ford numbers last week, and Ford's numbers are so low compared to what the targets were. And I don't know that they're going to be able to make up that difference or be able to sustain the amount of production that they need to do if these punitive damages are in place.
That's right, and could have cheaper Chinese imports.
Absolutely,
as a result.
and I think there's an industrial policy question here. The reason that Chinese cars have become so cheap and so ubiquitous now is because the government in China has basically been, for the last 20 years, helping those companies, promoting them. Now, we in a free market economy don't like talking about industrial policy, but to actively kind of hobble your original car makers feels to me a little bit short-sighted.
OK. We've got to finish on Luke Littler. I think we're going to be talking about him as much as possible today because it's such great news. His incredible achievement last night at the darts, and the front page of the Mirror carries the story. Before he'd won, so they've gone in on the amount he could earn if he were to win. But no doubt he'll make all tomorrow's front pages.
Absolutely.
After his achievement.
So Luke the Nuke and Michael Van Gerwen, last year they were worried that a 16-year-old, it was a one-hit wonder, and that it was going to be a flash in the pan and he had a really lucky go, but it wouldn't be a sustainable darts career. But I think he proved everyone wrong last night and just killed it. And it's people are so excited. We don't really do the darts thing in America, so I didn't grow up with it, but sports fans are definitely all over it.
I'd like to know what a 17-year-old does with £50 million.
Well, ask Justin Bieber.
Well, yes. Well, hopefully we'll be talking to him a little bit later on so we can ask
Justin
just
Bieber.
that question. Not Justin Bieber. Oh, let's get him on. Why not? He'll join us to do the papers. I'll see you both in the next hour, but for the moment, thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered.